Well, good morning again. The surgeon says that one night during his residency, he was called out of a sound sleep to the emergency room. Unshaven and with tousled hair, he showed up accompanied by an equally unpresentable medical student. In the ER, they encountered the on-call medical resident and his student, both neatly attired in clean white lab coats. The medical resident said to a student, "You can always tell the surgeons by their absolute disregard for appearance." 2 evenings later, the same young surgical resident was at a banquet when he was called to the ER for yet another emergency. He was stitching away on his patient, this time wearing a tuxedo from the banquet, when he encountered that same medical resident with his student. The medical resident looked at the surgical resident, now wearing the tuxedo, and then said to his student, "He sure is sensitive to criticism, isn't he?" Have you ever been unfairly criticized by someone else, a family member perhaps, or a colleague, or a customer? It happens to all of us. No one is exempt. The Gettysburg Address is considered the most eloquent oration in U.S. history, and yet the editor of the Chicago Times, a prominent newspaper of its day, ridiculed that address, which had been delivered, of course, by President Abraham Lincoln. On November 20th, 1863, the day after Lincoln delivered his famous speech, the editor of the Times wrote, "The cheek of every American must tingle with shame as he reads the silly, fat, and dishwatery utterances of the man who has been pointed out to intelligent foreigners as the President of the United States." You see, sooner or later, all of us have to deal with criticism. But let me ask you now a second question. Has anyone ever tried to flatter you? That is, have they ever tried to praise you extravagantly? Let me guess. We are not nearly as sensitive to flattery as we are to criticism, are we? I chuckled when I read the story about the late, great motivational speaker, Cavett Robert. Robert was a humble, kind man who was also a successful lawyer, salesman, and founder of the National Speakers Association. Robert once told of looking out his window one morning and seeing a skinny 12-year-old boy going door to door selling books. Robert further noticed that the boy was headed for his house. Robert turned to his wife and said, "Just watch me teach this kid a lesson about selling." After all these years of writing books about communication, lecturing all over the country, Robert continued, I might as well share some of my wisdom with him. I don't want to hurt his feelings, but I'll get rid of him before he knows what's happened. I've used this technique for years and it works every time. Then I'll go back and teach him how to deal with people like me. Mrs. Robert watched as the 12-year-old boy knocked on the door. Cavett Robert opened the door and quickly explained that he was a very busy man. He had no interest in buying any books, but he said, "I will give you 1 minute, but then I have to leave. I have a plane to catch." The young salesman was not daunted by Robert's brush-off. He simply stared at the tall, gray-haired, distinguished-looking man, a man that he knew was fairly well-known and quite wealthy. The boy said, with a sound of awe in his voice, "Sir, could you be the famous Cavett Robert?" To which Robert replied, "Come on in, son." Mr. Robert bought several books from the youngster, books that he admitted he might never read. The boy had mastered one principle, the principle of making the other person feel important, and it worked. Sometimes we are criticized. People say unfair, negative things. Sometimes we're flattered. People puff us up and make us feel better about ourselves than is really healthy. So how do you get to the point that neither praise nor criticism affects your day? The Apostle Paul knew what it was to be criticized. In the New Testament church, there was a group of people known as the Judaizers, I should say, who wanted to keep Christianity as a Jewish sect. Since Paul was determined to take the faith to the Gentiles, these Judaizers looked for every opportunity to find fault with him. They accused him of being in the ministry just for the money. Now that was a joke. Paul continued to support himself as a tent maker after he began his ministry so that he wouldn't be a financial burden on young, struggling Christian congregations. Those who knew Paul best knew that he did nothing for his own gain. These Judaizers also accused him of spreading lies and untruths. Again, they were way off target. Paul did not soft-pedal the gospel or use flattery upon his hearers. He told it like it was, as Howard Cosell used to say, and still they criticized. And so Paul was forced to defend himself. He writes in his first letter to the Thessalonians, "You know we never used flattery, nor did we put on a mask to cover up greed. God is our witness. We were not looking for praise from people, not from you or anyone else." So then, what was Paul looking for? Paul gives the answer in the same passage. We are not trying to please people, but God, who tests our hearts. Paul had no interest in pleasing people. Paul lived to please God. Would you like your life to be impervious to the hurtful or unhelpful opinions of other people? Would you like to live so that you are not fazed either by criticism or flattery? Here is the answer. Live to please God. It's a simple thing. If your primary audience is God, and if your primary goal is to have God say at the end of your life, "Well done, my good and faithful servant," then what difference would it make what other people say about you? It would make no difference whatsoever. So how do you live to please God? Paul gave us the answer both in his words and in his life. First of all, to please God, live with integrity. That's what the Apostle Paul did. He says to the church at Thessalonica, "For the appeal we make does not spring from error or impure motives, nor are we trying to trick you. On the contrary, we speak as those approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel. You know we never use flattery, nor did we put on a mask to cover up greed. God is our witness." Paul lived a life of integrity. Living a life of integrity is more than simply keeping the commandments. There are many people of whom it could be said that they have never killed, never stolen, never committed adultery. That doesn't mean that they live a life of integrity. Keeping the commandments is an outward act. Living a life of integrity comes from within. Dr. Haddon Robinson once told the story of a writer for a newspaper in Toronto, Canada, who undertook an investigation into the ethical practices of auto repair shops in his town. He took a spark plug wire off of his engine, making the car run unevenly. He took the car into different shops and asked them to fix it. Time after time, people sold him unnecessary repairs or charged him for repairs that weren't done. Finally, he went to a small garage. A fellow named Fred came out, popped open the hood, and said, "Let me listen to that thing." After a few seconds, he told the reporter, "I think I know what's wrong." He reached down and grabbed the wire, announcing, "Your spark plug wire came off," and he put it back on. The reporter asked, "What do I owe you?" "I'm not going to charge you anything," Fred replied. "I didn't have to fix anything. I just reattached the wire." The writer then told Fred what he was doing and that he had been charged all kinds of money by mechanics looking at that same wire. He asked Fred, "Why didn't you charge me anything?" Fred said, "Are you sure you want to know? I happen to be a Christian and believe that everything we do should glorify God. I'm not a preacher and I'm not a missionary, but I am a mechanic, and so I do it honestly. I do it skillfully, and I do it to the glory of God. The next day in the newspaper was the headline that read, Christian Mechanic, Honest to the Glory of God. Integrity is honesty. It is an uncompromising commitment to be truthful and trustworthy. In the fourth round of a national spelling bee in Washington, D.C., 11-year-old Rosalie Elliott, a champion from South Carolina, was asked to spell the word avowal. Her soft southern accent made it difficult for the judges to determine if she had used an A or an E as the next to last letter of the word. The judges deliberated for several minutes and also listened to a tape recording of playbacks, but they couldn't determine which letter had been pronounced. Finally, the chief judge, John Lloyd, put the question to the only person who knew the answer. He asked Rosalie, was the letter an A or an E? Rosalie, surrounded by whispering young spellers, knew by now the correct spelling of the word. But without hesitation, she replied that she had misspelled the word and had used an E. As she walked from the stage, the entire audience stood and applauded her honesty and integrity, including dozens of newspaper reporters who were covering the event. While Rosalie had not won the contest, she had definitely emerged a winner that day. Do you want to please God? Live a life of integrity. Now that's hard to do in a world like ours. We live in Spin City, when prominent and influential people from every walk of life hedge the truth. They don't steal, not in the classic understanding of the word. They don't kill. They don't overtly disobey God's law. They simply shade the truth. They use flattery and deceit. Often they are motivated by greed. It's not good business to be completely honest about your wares. Advertisers would be unemployed overnight. A life of integrity won't make you popular. However, it will make you respected. Even more importantly, there is an audience of one who will be applauding. Want to live a life pleasing to God? Well, here's the first ingredient. Live a life of integrity. And here's the second. Live a life of love. The Apostle Paul writes, we are not trying to please people, but God who tests our hearts. Even though as apostles of Christ, we could have asserted our authority, instead we were like young children among you. Just as a nursing mother cares for her children, so we cared for you. Because we loved you so much, we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well. The reason Paul had such an impact on the churches he served was that the people knew he genuinely cared about them. As has been often said, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. The Apostle Paul cared. In 1821, a young lawyer named Thaddeus Stevens took the case of a slave owner whose slave Charity Butler had run away. Stevens argued successfully for the prosecution, and Butler was returned to her slave owner. Case won. Now, according to the standards of his profession, Stevens should have been elated, but the opposite was true. Historians believe that this case affected Stevens deeply. He knew that he had just been successful in an unjust case. This didn't cause him elation, but shame. As a result, he became a passionate advocate against slavery. He went on to serve 7 terms in the U.S. Congress and was the driving force behind the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, guaranteeing equal protection under the law and giving slaves who had been set free the right to vote. You may remember Thaddeus Stevens, as portrayed by Tommy Lee Jones, figured prominently in the critically acclaimed movie Lincoln. But what you may not know is that in 2002, while excavating parts of Stevens' property, archaeologists discovered that Stevens also had beneath his home a hidden passageway, most likely used to hide runaway slaves escaping by way of the Underground Railroad. Thaddeus Stevens went beyond being a man who simply was honest and upright. He became a man with a cause, the cause of the abolition of slavery. He became a man intent on pleasing God. It's like something Tony Campolo, professor emeritus of sociology at Eastern College in Pennsylvania, and a dynamic preacher of the gospel once said. What you commit yourself to be will change what you are and make you into a completely different person. Let me repeat that. Not the past, but the future conditions you, because what you commit yourself to become determines what you are more than anything that ever happened to you yesterday or the day before. Therefore, I ask you a very simple question. What are your commitments? Where are you going? What are you going to be? You show me somebody who hasn't decided, and I'll show you somebody who has no identity, no personality, and no direction. The Apostle Paul had a direction for his life, and neither his critics nor those who tried to veer him off course with flattery or lies can make a dent in his contribution. He knew what it took to live a life pleasing to God, living a life of integrity, and living a life of love. Another preacher named Tony Evans, said it beautifully as well. When your passion upon getting up each morning is to say, how can I make God look good today? When the passion of your life is to someday open your eyes in eternity and hear Jesus say, well done, my good and faithful servant. When that becomes the consuming passion of your existence, it absolutely transforms your everyday experience. Does that describe how you live your life? Well, isn't it about time it did? How can I make God look good today? How can I live to please God? The answer is simple. By the grace of God, live a life of integrity and live a life of love. Will you please pray with me? Lord, just as you called Paul, you have placed a call on each of our hearts. You call us not only to a particular vocation, but that in all that we do to follow you, serve others, and worship you. You call us to live lives of integrity. You call us to live lives of love. You have given us what we need to do our work. Now strengthen us so whatever we do it to please you. Amen.